Well, thank you so much for joining us. Just a bit of background for you. I'm Sarah Holmes, and we also have Harriet Pattison here who'll speak in a few moments. And we're from the School of Education at Liverpool Hope University. Um, for myself, I'm involved in doing lots of research about children's faith and family faith and that sort of thing. Harriet's particularly involved in home educating research. So to combine together, we've sort of combined to bring this expertise. We were approached last year around the beginnings of the school bill. Well, that was being proposed, and we were sort of asked to perhaps try and sort of gather some experiences, some perspectives, some views, and so on. And so that was the impetus for this piece of research. And of course, the schools bill for now has been dropped. However, we just find it really interesting, much of the underlying kind of feelings, thoughts, beliefs, understandings, perspectives that are kind of going on in there. So we've pulled together quite a few strands of this research. I think we'll be producing probably 4 academic papers out of this, and then spilling that out as well more widely. But we're very keen as well that this research is helpful to Christian home educators, but particularly we want to try and see if we can bring about some kind of change in some of these aspects. So we'll present our findings for about half an hour now, things that we've observed in the data that we've collected. And then for the last 20 minutes or so, we'd be really interested to hear your thoughts and your perspectives on this, because we want to see how we can try and sort of tackle some of these issues and bring about some change. So on the next slide, you'll see we did an online survey. And to begin with, we were not sure how many people would respond, but we had an amazing response, 462 respondents. We had 21 questions on the survey. There were very full answers. So people were able to give quite lengthy answers, and many people did, which was great because we could just really grasp and kind of get the sense of what people's heart was behind a lot of this. And so took quite a lot of analysing, crunching and various things, but we've pulled out some really interesting strands that we'll share with you. You'll see here that this was some of the organisations and support networks and so on that people who responded said they were belonging to. So a really good range there. So we did this online survey asking questions partly about the schools bill, but also partly about the kind of background things. So on this slide, you'll see here, we asked, how does your faith influence your home educating practice? I wasn't going to present now too much about the actual schools bill because it's now been put to one side for now, but we do have that information if you want that as well. So it was interesting to see here some of these things that people were saying in terms of, on the left there, you'll see in terms of teaching and learning practices. There was obviously a strong component there in terms of how faith influences that. Social activities also, and curriculum there, and also the timetable and routine. And so it seems that it was very clear that faith was a major consideration. You'll see in the pie chart there on the bottom, a major consideration for 75% of these participants in why they're home educating. However, on the next slide, you'll see some of the kind of underlying experiences that people were talking about, I guess not surprising, but quite frustrating and disappointing to read. So about connection first. And so as we sort of were reading through much of the narrative, much of the answers that people were saying, there was an awful lot about people feeling a lack of inclusion. So we asked, you'll see there on the left, we said, how do you think Christian home educators are viewed by wider society? And there was over half of the participants said negatively. And then we asked, what's your experience of the wider Christian community? You'll see that at the bottom there. And there was a significant portion saying that there was support there, but there was also quite a few talking about it being an unsupportive or neutral environment. And then at the top, you'll see we asked about the local church, and it was great to see that almost half of participants were saying that that was a supportive environment, the local church, but then there were others talking about not sure, neutral, unsupportive, and so on. And it was interesting. I'll just share with you some of the other responses people were saying. outside of that. People were talking about in sort of wider society, just not feeling welcome, perhaps being mocked at times, feeling like outsiders, misunderstood, judged, and some really strong words and phrases about people saying that we're negligent, we're extremists, we're fundamentalists, we're people, we're intolerant. And these real strong feelings coming through, really just showing some quite negative experiences that people were having. And as we kind of looked at the wider Christian community, people were talking about that there is support, but perhaps it's rather superficial. And there were some who were talking about feeling extremely well supported by the Christian community, by the local church. But then there were also these people saying, well, people seem to be concerned and they perhaps feel threatened or uncomfortable about this. So it was really very, very striking as we read through, very, very sad at times to hear some of the experiences that people were reporting here. When we asked about the local church, as I say, some people were saying they felt very well supported, which is great. Some people said they felt accepted. And yet others were saying there's kind of the church is perhaps disinterested, or there's limited interaction, there's no support. Most people at church don't agree with us home educating. Some people don't approve. And so there was this sense of perhaps a misunderstanding and a bit of a mismatch in terms of that. And so when we asked, what do you want? What would you like to see? What are your desires in terms of support from the church? People were talking about having more activities, perhaps some advocacy and some support in that way, facilitating groups, actually some theological teaching on biblical parenting and what that might mean, really digging into that sort of thing. Being able to use the church's building for home educating groups and so on. And then some people talking about pooling resources and talents. So it was really interesting in terms of the sense of connection and connecting with the wider society. But I was particularly interested, how are people feeling as part of the Christian community and the local church? So these are kind of really interesting. And then I think on the next slide, I can't remember, or maybe not. The next thing that I was sort of pulling out was about parental responsibilities. And this is another thing that I pulled together a paper on, the kind of the theological thinking behind these sort of things. And so as we were sort of reading the responses, we were seeing there, here are some comments on the right-hand side of the screen there. People saying it's concerning because the government, the Department for Education, are wanting to take away from us as Christian parents what we believe is our responsibility to raise our children in the way that we want to raise them. And so a lot of there's some comments there for you. It's a very concerning piece of legislation. It's removing parental responsibility and these sorts of things. There at the bottom we see, I'm also afraid that the answers I've given are exactly what's kind of causing this kind of thing. They want to stop faith education. And many people were quoting various, particularly Old Testament passages about their biblical understanding of my responsibility as a parent to raise my child, to educate them, to instill values, my Christian beliefs, my way of living into my child. And this sense that, yes, the schools bill particularly challenges that, but a bit more generally concern for that. And so just some of the strands coming through in terms of desires to instill Christian values, very much a sense of calling by many of our participants, calling to be involved in this way, to be home educating their children, a desire to remove their child from a toxic environment, which many perceive the school system to be, and that very strong, this loss of freedom and a loss of voice. And so these were the sort of the themes that were coming through that I particularly looked at in terms of what is the inclusion and the sense of belonging that I've talked about on the previous slide for Christian home educators. But then, as I say on this slide, this real challenge and undermining of the parental responsibilities of a biblical perspective. So these are two of the strands that I've particularly pulled out. And what we're kind of keen to do is to perhaps use this research to go to some of the, church policymakers and so on, and to kind of grapple with some of these things. As an aside, another piece of research that I've been doing with the Church of England is kind of looking the other way at this topic. So what can churches learn from Christian home educators? And I've got a colleague who's been working on that with me. And we've been really trying to unpack actually that because Christian home educators are so strongly and significantly involved in their children's faith and nurturing their child's faith, actually there's a lot we can learn from that as the church. So looking at it that way. So that's in the process of being written up at the moment as well. So that one's going to come. But I'm going to hand over to Harriet now, who's been looking at the sort of perhaps the political, philosophical kind of perspectives again on these 460 odd survey responses. So I'll hand over to Harriet now.
Hi, thank you, Sarah. Okay, thanks very much. I'm Harriet Pattison. I'm one of Sarah's colleagues in the School of Education, an erstwhile home educator myself, and I have done various sort of bits of research around home education. And it's really nice to be involved in this particular project as well. So my part in this was to think about how can we address the issue of Christian home education through a political lens. And the theory that I have chosen to do that exploration through is the theory of a Canadian political philosopher called Will Kymlicka. He's been researching, thinking, writing about multiculturalism for several decades now. He's Canadian and he's been very active in First Nation rights in Canada, but he's also been a political advisor in other countries as well about multiculturalism. And I think we might find his work useful as a way of thinking about Christian home education. So when it comes to looking at minority groups within a society, Kymlicka's got two main concerns, two main avenues that he explores. And the first of those is to do with external protection. And his argument is that if you have minority groups within a pluralistic society, there may be times when those minority groups need protection in order to carry out their culture, their traditional way of life, their religious faith, to uphold the values of their particular communities. And he argues that pluralistic societies need to put those kind of external protections for those groups in place. Otherwise, they run the danger of being marginalized, discriminated against, subsumed into wider society. Kymlicka himself doesn't concentrate on religion. He concentrates more on cultural matters, but I think the significance for religious minorities is clear. There is also perhaps another layer to religious marginalization or discrimination, and that is the second quote here from Eamon Callan thinking about that situation, saying that if parents are denied the opportunity either overtly or through simply through the structures of society, if they are denied the opportunity to bring children up in their own faith, that is an undermining of fundamental meaning in their own lives. And I think also we can also argue that it is an act of religious discrimination. So we've got that idea of external protection, protecting minority groups within society or particular groups within society. Then the other kind of trajectory of Kymlicka's concern is to do with internal restriction. And it doesn't necessarily mean that a group who deserves external protection with the society imposes internal restrictions on their members, but it is possible, and there are several examples of it. And this is where the collective, the minority collective, imposes its values or its particular lifestyle, its behavior, its beliefs onto its members, and doesn't allow them to exercise the freedoms which would normally be accorded to them as members of the wider society. So Kimlicker's examples are things like forced marriages, arranged marriages, sanctioned gender violence. So things that go on within minority groups and are considered to be traditional or acceptable within minority groups, but which are not acceptable in mainstream society. So it's those two aspects, the external protection and the internal restriction, that I have been looking at. And the first part of that is to think about, well, do Christian home educators, do they constitute a minority group within society who would be recognised through Kimlicker's theory as being in need of external protection? And the first thing to do is to establish that they are a group at all. And I've got the pie chart that Sarah showed earlier on this slide, because I think it's very telling about this question, as well as the things that Sarah was talking about. 3/4 of the Christian home educators say that their faith is a major reason in choosing to home educate. So I think we can make a distinction. We need to make a distinction between, there are lots of home educators, some of them happen to be Christian, and that there is a particular group of Christian home educators who see that as their identity. Again, some of the things that Sarah talked about, the fact that Christian home educators feel that they are viewed so negatively by wider society, the fact that they feel so vulnerable in the face of impending or possible legislation that might restrict their practices, that they are going to be marginalised and put in a position where they are not able to practice their faith. And there's a little quote down there, one of many actually, where parents said that they felt very vulnerable in this position. They felt very vulnerable that they would not be able to continue to carry out their faith in the ways that they wanted to. We drew out 3 strands from the open responses, from the qualitative responses, which back up, I think, those ideas about marginalisation, politicisation and misunderstanding of Christian home educators. So in terms of marginalisation, lots of people were making the comment, you know, we don't matter. Nobody knows that we exist. And if they do, they don't care about us. As Sarah said as well, you know, there was quite strong politicisation of the position of Christian home educators. Things like people think that we are right-wing extremists, we're fundamentalists, we're bigoted, viewed as intolerant with dangerous viewpoints, and very much the feeling that there was a very negative public perception. A lot of that based on misunderstanding, which the Christian home educators didn't feel able to correct themselves, didn't have sufficient voice themselves to explain, this is who we are, this is what we want to do, this is why we want to do it. But a lot of inaccurate portrayal, particularly the media. And a lot of the concern circled around this question of, what are parents responsible for? What is the state responsible for? And who makes decisions? Who makes decisions about education? And a feeling amongst the Christians, this isn't just a political matter. This is also a very basic matter of faith, and of being able to bring children up, not simply in their faith, but parents themselves enacting their own duty as Christians by doing that. So that's I think, in terms of external protection and putting forward a case for saying there should be some external protection of this minority group within society, I think there is sufficient grounds to begin an argument around that using Kimlicker's theory. But we also need to address the ideas of internal restriction and how they might apply to Christian home education. So a lot of the criticism of Christian home education comes from the United States, where, you know, as I expect you know, there is a very large and powerful political organising of Christian home educators, but there is also a lot of vocal feeling against what they're doing as well. And I think a lot of the arguments will be transatlantic. You know, they are either used here already, or they will be if the debate gets more public. So internal restrictions, restrictions about contact with the wider world, the idea that Christian children, if they are home educated, they will be kept away from the rest of the world. They will not be part of mainstream society, and that this will be part of inculcating in them particular intolerances towards other groups within society. So LGBTQ plus groups often come up in the discussions and saying that children will be brought up to be intolerant of practices like homosexuality that wider society finds acceptable. Also the charge that Christian education may internally restrict the worldview of Christian children because it educates them in non-mainstream understandings of particular issues. So, for example, creationism rather than evolution, and that this is an internal restriction on their education. And also a kind of more nebulous charge that children who are Christian, who are home educated as Christians, will be denied the normal experiences of childhood. So arguably in our society, one of those is going to school, but over and beyond that, particular experiences of play or particular types of punishment or particular socialization experiences that will be denied them. So obviously, these kind of charges, these internal restrictions, that they're never things that stand alone. They always have to be framed within what's going on in the wider society, because they are largely subjective and they are comparative. And the thing is, I think, particularly for Christian home educators, is that what is going on in wider society at the moment in this country is secularization. And certainly the religious content has been or the Christian content has been being altered within mainstream schooling for some time. And I have a quote here from Helen Penn, who is an academic thinker around childhood issues and early childhood. And she's putting forth the view there that, you know, education should be entirely secular. If you want to have a faith, that's a private matter, and you do that, you know, within the four walls of your home or on Sunday mornings or whatever, but it doesn't have a place in education. And that is a very perhaps extreme in the way that it is expressed, but I think there is a prevailing view that that is becoming the place of faith in our society. So I think we need to address the issue of whether Christian home education does impose internal restrictions on children, and if it does, how it does that, and what might be perhaps ways of addressing that charge, and perhaps opening up a political dialogue around these concerns. So Kimlicka argues that liberal societies must allow the space for evangelization, for parents to have the opportunity to bring their children up in their faith, but that needs to be counterbalanced by the opportunity for children who are being brought up in a particular faith or with a particular set of values to reflect, to question, and if they want to reject the faith of their heritage. And that brings us to quite a tricky line in the discussion, because one of the charges against Christian home education is the idea that children will be indoctrinated if they are brought up in educated in a particular faith curriculum and outlook, and that's the way in which secular education now presents religion, which is a sort of a learning about faith, learning about different faiths. So, you know, so learning a little bit about the world religions, what their practices are, what their values are, what their beliefs are, and then the idea being that children can then decide for themselves, you know, oh, I think I'd like to be a Christian, or, you know, I feel drawn towards Buddhism, or whatever it is, and that kind of approach can be taken to religious education. Kimlicka says that this is not certainly not the only way, but is not a particularly authentic way of going about upholding beliefs within minority communities. And he talks about living life from the inside, and that in order to really understand what a particular faith is valuing, is practicing, is believing, there has to be an authentic understanding of the narratives that make that bring the meaning into that faith, and that without those, it's a bit like an empty shell, I suppose. You know, you can't really tell what it's all about. And so the idea that bringing children up in a faith is necessary for them to really understand what that faith is about. And certainly I took this second quote on the slide there from Vigilante et al. This was research carried out in the United States with Christian parents, and one of the parents there saying, you know, we just can't rely on somebody else to teach them something that they don't believe. Now, there are debates within education about the way in which professional teachers may be able to present children with faith alternatives without weighting any of those against the others, and without actually revealing what they themselves believe, because obviously that would have a huge impact on how they are delivering that information to children. But there was also a feeling that, you know, this just really isn't possible for an authentic education. All of that's compounded by the fact that, you know, obviously there is not one kind of Christian education or Christian home education. There are multiple kinds, and that there will be a lot of variety, and that anything sort of thoughts and arguments coming out of this are going to have to cope with that heterogeneity. So looking across at Kimlicker's ideas about evangelism, about questioning, rejecting, and apostasy, possibilities of within faith education. So looking again at the open responses, the things that the Christian home educators said in the survey, there was a lot of evidence of people being very passionate about the Christian education that they were giving their children, and feeling their own spiritual duty in enacting that. So stock quote, you know, very much led by the word and the spirit, and felt that we needed to bring our children up knowing God's truth and with a biblical worldview. So very much coming from that perspective. But there was also a lot of evidence as well about opportunities for children to ask questions, to challenge, and not to take up the faith in as much as to actually reject it, but also to decide this isn't for me. So these are some of the quotes that some of the things that parents said, is say this is just a very small collection of some very, very interesting and deep and thoughtful things that parents told us. So children need to be challenged with what other children are being taught, so they can critically appraise other viewpoints. And people very overtly said, you know, to have a true Christian education, children have to know why they believe what they believe. It's not a question of us bringing them up, you know, just sort of closing them down into our worldview. They have to know about the rest of the world, and they have to understand why they believe what they believe. And a parent making the point that you don't inherit being a Christian. It's not a matter of you can just bring your child up in your own faith and that's it. You know, those children have to commit themselves. They have to make a personal commitment to the faith themselves, if that is the way that they want to go. And a parent simply can't do that on their behalf. And there was also this final quote here. I did some research a few years back with Muslim home educators, and one of the things that was really interesting about talking to them is that there was a kind of their perspective kind of inverted sometimes what was happening in the mainstream. And I think the view from the outside, as Sarah and I have alluded to in some of the things that the Christian home educators told us, is the feeling that the Christian home education will be very narrow. It will inculcate children in very particular views. It will not give them the freedom to make the choices that might be available to other children. But some parents inverted that and said, actually, if we send them to school, they will not be free to follow the Christian faith if that's what they decide to do. School will hammer, the school environment will hammer that out of them. It will be too difficult for them to do that in that environment. So it's a kind of inversion of the mainstream, and I think that bears a lot of exploring as we go forward. Speaking of which, next steps. So I think from the work that I've led around this, that we do have grounds for putting forward an argument about the need for external protection for Christian and maybe for all religious home education. I think we do need to confront some of the questions around internal restrictions. We know that they cause a lot of concern in mainstream society and maybe are at the root of some of the things that some of the negative comments that the Christian home educators have received. And I've kind of jotted down some of my own thoughts there about how they might be addressed in responses from groups, from different churches, from other kinds of collectives, from individuals. Also, the need to raise dialogue and to be talking to people in mainstream politics, media, about these issues, local authorities, thinking about research, how research might assist us going forwards, and thinking about education as well as educating the educated, education for the authorities, for politicians, for wider groups in society, rather than education for children on this occasion. And we also need to address the thorny question of oversight and guidance and where this is going to come from and what kind of relations are going to be around that. We do have a feedback survey and we will share the link with that, because it would be really interesting when the group is closed tonight if people could feedback to us and let us know how useful they've found this and what their thoughts are. We hope to gather some of those now, but it would also be good to have some written responses as well. And we are hoping, Sarah and I are hoping, that we may be able to set up some focus groups, potentially in London and Manchester, to discuss further the research findings and to think about how some of this might be taken forward in ongoing strategies and eventually into policy frameworks.